Reality, captured in user-friendly symbols and processed for understanding. The Idea Channel.
I'm David Horowitz. I'm nearly 50 years old now, and I can remember the summer of 1945, the people dancing in the streets when World War II was over. And I can tell you that in all that time, the United States has never been in such danger as it is today. And the reason the United States is in this danger is that the people, American people, are unaware. They're asleep. And if I have a mission in my life at this point, it is to wake the American people up.
What is it that you want to wake people up to, David?
Well, I grew up in the communist movement in this country. My parents were members of the Communist Party. When I was young and other people were going to see Doris Day and Rock Hudson movies on Broadway, my family would go over to 8th Avenue to the Stanley Theater and see Soviet films. And so I'm very familiar with what's called the progressive movement in this country and how it identifies, often from very good intentions, with the totalitarian powers, in particular the Soviet Empire, which since my youth has expanded from with one huge continental nation to, well, 15 or 20 nations. It has, and when I was young, the Soviets were overthrowing governments and consolidating their power in Eastern Europe. Today, they are consolidating power on the landmass of the Americas itself.
Well, when you were young, you were already involved. That's an unusual background for someone in the United States.
Not for somebody born into the left. People have to understand, one thing that Americans don't understand is that there is a, what I would call a culture of communism in this country, that there is a community. The left is really a quasi-religious movement. I went to communist camps. I attended a communist nursery school. All my friends were children of communists, or progressives as they call themselves, or fellow travelers as they were called in those days. People from this broad-based cultural left. When I was 9 years old, it was the first march I remember. I marched in the May Day parade down 7th Avenue to Union Square, and the slogans of the May Day parade were, say, remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, we don't want another war, 5, 6, 7, 8, win with Wallace in '48. Henry Wallace had been Roosevelt's vice president, and he had formed in 1948, he had broken with Truman, Harry Truman, who was a president, and the Democratic Party to form the Progressive Party. Unknown to him, the Progressive Party was controlled by the Communist Party. And the Wallace Peace Campaign of 1948 was really a campaign against the Truman Doctrine, the doctrine that President Truman had announced to fight a communist insurgency in Greece. It's very parallel to what's going on in Central America today, except it was Europe. We progressives said that the Greek colonels that the United States was supporting were fascists. We said that the communist guerrillas were nationalists, and they were interested in national liberation. Fortunately, in those days, the American people were anti-communist. They had seen one move after another that Stalin made in Eastern Europe. And so aid was sent to the so-called fascist Greek colonels. It was a dictatorship in Greece. And as a result, now, 40 years later, Greece is a democracy. There are actually socialists in power in Greece, whereas in all the countries where Stalin won in East Europe, those very socialists were put in jail or had their fingernails pulled out or were executed. So I feel it was in the anti-communist Cold War of the late 40s and the early 50s. Americans had a healthy understanding of the communist threat, and as a result, Western Europe was saved, and Greece was saved, and so forth.
But you and your parents didn't have a healthy understanding of that threat, based on what you're saying.
No, my parents were immigrants. I think the left taps a lot of fears of people, insecurities. I mean, my parents my father was an immigrant, my mother was a child of immigrants, and this is an intimidating country, and people on the left, a lot of them are just people who have never integrated with this country. I went to the White House, not to see the president, but as speechwriters last year, and I felt for the first time I was, a member of my family was setting foot on American soil. I mean, you can see it today, where radical demagogues exploit, Latin immigrants coming into this country and try to radicalize them and so forth. Immigrant communities tend to be hotbeds of radicalism for one reason or another.
Were you intellectually involved at that point, or just emotionally? Was it, I'm a 9-year-old and let's have fun running down 7th Avenue, or did you really?
No, I was a very serious child. One of the things, slight resentments I have against my radical upbringing was that it robbed me of my childhood in a way. I don't want that, to overstate that, but there was a way in which I grew up. I was always concerned about the fate of Negro Americans at the time, people, black people in America, although we call them Negroes. I can remember, as an 8 or 9-year-old, mentally composing speeches to President Truman because I was terrified of the coming war, and I felt that, my parents and I read the Daily Worker, we were good people. I felt the Soviets, were good people, and that America was at fault, and there were warmongers, and we call them warmongers in those days in Washington, and Wall Street was pushing us towards war. You can see that right now. You have very well-meaning Americans, particularly in the churches now, who imagine that the Sandinistas in Nicaragua are idealistic and social reformers, and do not see that they are, ruthless totalitarians, and that they are agents of Soviet and expansion in this hemisphere. But in those days, my parents and their friends were very isolated. In the U.S. Congress, I remember our congressman was Vito Marcantonio, and when North Korea attacked South Korea, there was a vote in the Congress, and the vote was 580 to 1. Marcantonio was the only vote against aid to the South Koreans fighting for their independence from North Korean communist aggression. Now, you have dozens of Marcantonios in the Congress. By that I mean you have people who actually support the goals of Fidel Castro, or we have a presidential candidate, Jesse Jackson, who is embraced Fidel Castro, and called Daniel Ortega the Abraham Lincoln of his country. You not only have lots of Marcantonios, but you have lots of progressives in the Congress, people who do not want the United States opposing communist expansion in this hemisphere, who refuse to see the threat of that expansion. That's why you have the Boland Amendment, which tied President Reagan's hands in fighting in supporting the freedom fighters in Nicaragua and fighting the Sandinista regime. And you have, in the process of being consolidated, a Soviet base in the hemisphere on the American landmass itself.
A real critical point, I think, at this time. I think you should define conservative and liberal in your mind, because I think that's going to be a thread throughout this. And people are going to say, David Horowitz is now a conservative. I think we should address that.
Well, I am a conservative. When I was a progressive of the left, I had all these ideas about the world, what the world should be like. I have lived, a long time, and have seen how those ideas have led to, incredible catastrophes, how the idea that we had of making South Vietnam free has led to a communist dictatorship, has led to hundreds of thousands of people being executed, millions slaughtered in Cambodia, hundreds of thousands of boat people fleeing. I have seen how the revolution that we supported in Cuba has turned, that would bring prosperity to the poor of Cuba, that would make them powerful, that would bring freedom to Cuba, has turned Cuba into a prison, has made it poorer than ever, and has created a situation where Fidel Castro is sending 50,000, has 50,000, mercenaries really running around Africa and other countries of the world, spreading terror and supporting bloody dictatorships. So for me, to be a conservative, it means that I see that America is a good place. It's the best place in this world. I mean, we are a country, unlike the communist countries, which have walls around them to keep people in. We have a problem that so many people want to become part of the American dream. This is a land of opportunity. It is the freest country and the most tolerant of its ethnic groups in the world. And, for all its faults, it's something that I feel is worth preserving. I am grateful for having been born in this country and want to preserve it. That makes me a conservative. I feel that, I never regarded myself as a liberal. I was a radical or revolutionary and a progressive, the progressive being kind of a cover that the left uses when it doesn't want to admit to its real agendas. But liberals, when I was young, the communists and the left were stigmatized. That is, people understood that they were loyal to the Soviet Union, as we were, and they understood that they wanted to destroy the American way of life, which we did, and which the left does to this day. And therefore, they, so to speak, quarantined us. We were not thrown in jail. We were not tormented, but nobody listened to us. In those days, people who call themselves liberals, Harry Truman was a liberal. The liberals were leading the fight against the expansion of the Soviet Empire and against the domestic threat of communism. It was the Truman administration which instituted the loyalty programs and the security checks, which, I feel, I will tell you that looking at America today, I mean, it is terribly lax in its security measures. And the Truman administration was right to impose those security measures. The left was spying. It was transmitting intelligence to America's adversaries, and so forth. But in the course of the Vietnam War, something happened to American liberalism, and basically that anti-communist liberal center has collapsed. The truly anti-communist liberals are now a rump element in the Democratic Party. Men whom I can respect in the Democratic Party, like Senator Bill Bradley or Senator Nunn, who don't agree with my conservative views, but are militant in their, patriotism and their anti-communism. It's questionable as to whether they could be nominated by their own party. The party's machinery is controlled by its radical caucuses. And so liberalism has come to be what I would call McGovern liberalism. George McGovern started out in the Wallace campaign as a Wallace progressive. And what you really see today is that the Wallace Progressive Party, which opposed the anti-communist efforts of the United States to save the free world and to defend free peoples from communist expansion, those progressives are now in the Democratic Party instead of outside it, and they dominate it. So there is a liberalism, or there is a leftism today, and a fifth column mentality that parades itself as a liberalism, and that's why I think liberalism has become so, a kind of pejorative term in our time.
But it also has become, in a sense, a cover, hasn't it? In other words, we don't say left, we don't say progressive. We say
this is
liberal,
true. I mean, I've had this fight with a top editor of the Washington Post. I said, the Post describes Ron Dellums, Berkeley congressman, who's an extreme radical, who's a I mean, his heroes are Fidel Castro and the late Morris Bishop of Grenada. He is a, tireless advocate of policies that in support of the totalitarian adversary of this country. And Ron Dellums is described as a liberal in the Washington Post. This is a total misnomer. And Dellums likes the term because it provides him cover. Liberal is okay, and people understand that the left is threatening. So, I mean, this is actually what happened in the 50s. I mean, everybody is concerned about, the excesses of McCarthyism. Well, the excesses of McCarthyism came because the communists pretended that they were Jeffersonian Democrats. When they were indicted in the Smith Act trials and went to court, and the prosecutors would read Lenin, and Lenin would talk about overthrowing regimes and particularly, overthrowing the government and establishing a communist state. The Communist Party in its defense would say that Lenin, was really a Jeffersonian Democrat, and that's what they were about. The difference is that now the establishment media, like the Washington Post, accepts that definition. And one of the reasons they do is that my colleagues and friends from the radical 60s have, gone back into the American mainstream and, are a powerful presence in the American media.
There are some people watching this tape who I believe will say, well, were you, David Horowitz, ignorant? Were you dumb? Were you stupid? I mean, this is a dramatic change of position for you.
Well, was I dumb when I was a radical? I actually was people can draw whatever conclusions they want, but I was a very serious radical. I wrote a lot of books. Books about imperialism, books that were, really political economies, historical. I did a lot of research. The shift is this. I mean, one can understand it from, if you think of strategic planning. That is, the defense planners in this country. If you look at the Canadian border, I mean, we could put missiles all along the border and put armies there. The reason we don't is that Canada is a friendly country, that Canada's intentions are not hostile to us. Taking into account intentions is absolutely essential in strategic planning. When I look at the Soviet Union, or, I like other leftists could see, and leftists today will tell you, that it was, well, actually, when I was young, I didn't know it was a repressive state. I mean, the communists, in the days, the high tide of of world communism, communists actually believed the Soviet Union was paradise. But in the 60s, by the 60s, the left knew that the Soviet Union was a repressive police state. But what we said was, that communism would change, that we used to have the saying that the first socialist revolution would take place in the Soviet Union in the 60s. We in the New Left used to say that. And you can read it in leftist writings today. They talk about the progressive tendencies because, allegedly, because there is no ruling class, because there is social ownership of the means of production, all that's required is a little shift in the mentality and the political situation, and the Soviet Union will become, the paradise that leftists always imagine. It really flows from having a Marxist analysis that everything is determined by what the Marxists call the relations of production, by class relationships. If you believe that, then you believe that, having had, like the revolution of 1917, or if Cuba has all kinds of repressions, the reasons for those are lingering repression as leftovers from its capitalist past, the threat of capitalist encirclement. I mean, you can see it in the debate over Nicaragua today. I mean, the Sandinista rulers have for 20 years, since they began in 1962, their model has been the Soviet police state. They say it. But progressives and leftists today say that the reason for the repression in Nicaragua is Ronald Reagan, is that the United States has opposed the Sandinista regime and supported the freedom fighters. In fact, I would say now that the only reason there are any lingering freedoms in Nicaragua, few as they are, is that the United States has put the pressure it has on Nicaragua, on the Sandinistas, and the Sandinistas want to win over American public opinion. But leftists delude themselves, and in that sense, I don't think I was stupid, but I was self-deluded into ascribing saying that all the negative features of communist regimes or revolutionary regimes were caused by the United States. And that's something, you can see it in films today. For example, many people have seen The Killing Fields, which was about the events in Cambodia, where the communist Khmer Rouge, which the American left supported, slaughtered 2 million people. In the film, a reporter, the central figure, who was a New York Times reporter, ascribes these massacres to the Nixon. The United States dropped a lot of bombs in Cambodia, and that caused it. In fact, logic, elementary logic, once you're not blinded by leftist mentality, would show, we dropped atomic bombs on Japan, 2 atomic bombs on Japan. The bombing of Tokyo, which was conventional bombing, killed more people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And Japan is a democracy today. It didn't make the Japanese into bloodthirsty, genocidal, slaughterers. It did so in Cambodia. Because they were armed, the revolutionaries there, the Khmer Rouge, had Marxism for a guide, and they wanted to eliminate bourgeois mentality and the bourgeois system, and their leaders had been educated on the left bank by Sartre and Marxists, and they emptied the cities because the cities, the culture of capitalism, as it were, had been bred in the cities, and an awful lot of the people who died on these marches out of the cities and so forth. So the human capacity for self-delusion is infinite. And
well, there are a lot of people doing that today, as I understand, and that's one of your key points, that we need to be aware that people are still self-deluding themselves. But why did David Horowitz come to the conclusion that there is not going to be a Marxist paradise?
Well, I have to say, I've talked to a lot of people who've been through this process with me, or who've gone through parallel process, and it's a series of factors, and it takes a long time, and your kind of ideology unravels step by step. But if we focus just on the Vietnam War, I was not naive about communism. My parents had been communists. I thought when I was young that the Soviet Union was a paradise. I lived through the famous secret report that Khrushchev gave to the Politburo and the Central Committee of the Soviet Communist Party, talking about the crimes of Stalin. So I knew I was, by the time I was a new leftist, I was hostile to Stalinism and to that kind of communism. But I was more hostile to the United States, and I think that that's the defining characteristic of the left, that it's hostile to the United States. It's blame America for everything. It's America as the imperialist power. It's the poverty in the world is created by American capitalism, which is a lie, in my view, tantamount to the lie that the Jews killed Christ, because what it does is it incites people all over the world to go to war with America. Yet this is one of the biggest preachings, for example, of the liberation theology in American churches today. But I was fairly sophisticated about the Vietnamese communists. But I believed that there was an indigenous revolution in the South. I rejected, along with the entire left, when the Johnson administration came out with a white paper showing that North Vietnamese troops were in the South. We said that was lies, just the way the left now says, when there are presidential white papers, government white papers showing how the Nicaraguans have really fostered and supplied and armed that civil war in Salvador. They dismiss it. We dismiss these reports that the North Vietnamese had troops in South Vietnam. We said that South Vietnam had an indigenous revolution. And as a socialist, I believed that once the United States was out, there would be peace in Indochina, there would be economic development, and that these people would begin to enjoy a decent life. And what I saw was, and I also, as a Marxist and as somebody who had written a book called, it was called Empire and Revolution in this country, which was a whole, theory of imperialism and imperialism and revolution. I, along with the rest of the left, said the United States will never leave Indochina because, of the tin and tungsten, and because it would, it would create a domino effect. We believed in the domino theory, even though we denied it in our public statements. What I saw was that when the war was over, that North Vietnam had conquered South Vietnam. All the people that we supported in the South, the NLF people, were, fled in boats, or they were in prison, or they were dead, or they were insignificant. South Vietnam has been conquered by North Vietnam. We said there wouldn't be a bloodbath. It was an incredible bloodbath, where 100,000 people were summarily executed in the South after the war. 600,000 people died fleeing the country. The allies of the North Vietnamese, the Khmer Rouge, killed 2 million people in Cambodia. More people were killed by the communists in the first 3 years of their peace than had been killed in the entire 13 years of the anti-communist war. Today, Vietnam is one of the poorest countries in the world, but it has a standing army larger than that of the United States. The Vietnamese have conquered Cambodia and Laos now. The Soviet Union has moved into the bases at Cam Ranh Bay and Da Nang. The United States not only did not stay, it withdrew globally. And as a result, since the fall of Saigon, the Soviets have invaded and a process of attempting to conquer Afghanistan. The Cubans have intervened in 2 countries, at least in Africa. And 14 nations have fallen into the Soviet orbit. So I saw that the consequence of our victory, our left victory, was slaughter and misery for the people that we were supposed to be supporting, the Indo-Chinese, was the expansion of the Soviet totalitarian empire. The Soviets now have, for the first time in their history, war mortar ports. They're a Pacific power. And I also saw the response of the left, and that was that when Joan Baez wanted to protest the repression that the North Vietnamese communists were conducting in South Vietnam, she was denounced as a CIA agent by other leftists, and they refused to support her. So it was clear to me that the left had no principles. The left, it's always talking about human rights and peace and whatnot, but it really has only one principle, which is its hostility to America. It's anti-Americanism. It is, in my view, an enemy within. And that combination of the left's reaction to all these events, its refusal to denounce the Cuban interventions in Africa, and particularly in behalf of the Mengistu dictatorship in Ethiopia, which has not only slaughtered hundreds of thousands of people, but has spread this famine throughout Ethiopia. It's just turning the blind eye towards the Soviet aggression in Afghanistan, which has killed 1 million people. I mean, to me, the left is corrupt and immoral, and lacks all integrity, and is a threat to the real things that I see around me. I mean, to American reality. My life as a leftist, and that of most leftists, is a fantasy life. It's a fantasy of the future. Leftists have this dream of the future, which they think is a reality. And in the name of the future, they justify all their crimes in the present. As a conservative now, I mean, I am defending real things. I see the wealth of this country. I see how immigrant groups like the Vietnamese or the Koreans can come to this country poor and work their way up the economic ladder, just as my grandparents did. My grandfather earned $3 a week, and as a poor tailor, I had to work in a factory and sleep under his sewing machine. I see the opportunity in this country. I see its generosity, and I want to defend that.
You took a dramatic step, in a sense, with a speech that you gave at Berkeley. What was the date of that?
Well, I think it was in April '85.
April
Yeah,
85?
I was invited to go to Berkeley. One of the things that's happened is in the 60s, the left set out to destroy the university. I mean, that is not my analysis of what happened. That's what, the left, we all said we were doing. We were going to tear the mother down, tear the system down. In the 70s, after the left had been defeated in the streets, in its street revolution, it entered the universities, it entered the media, and it entered the U.S. Congress. And as a result, on the universities, leftists dominate the student governments. There's tremendous leftist presence in the faculty. And at UC Berkeley, they were holding what they called exploring the possibilities of peace in Central America, but it was really a Sandinista affair, pro-Sandinista affair. And I was invited, well, actually, I wasn't directly invited, but I was another ex-leftist who was still identified himself as a leftist, but was opposed to the Sandinista regime, was invited and got me invited. And I gave a speech in defense of the freedom fighters and the Reagan policy to 200 what I would call hardcore Berkeley radicals.
I'd like to read one quick statement from that speech. In every case, without exception, time has proved the left wrong. Now, this is David Horowitz talking to 200 of his previously associated left friends. Wrong in its views of the revolutionaries' intentions, and wrong about the facts of their revolutionary rule. And just as consistently, the anti-communists were proved right. Now, you obviously weren't in friendly territory when you made those kinds of statements.
No, I wasn't, but I'd like to note that I'm not the only one that's observed that. Susan Sontag, in a famous speech at Town Hall, where she described communism, and quite accurately in my view, as being fascism with a human face, pointed out that as she put it, that the average American reading the Reader's Digest would learn more truth about, over the years, would have an accurate picture of events going on in the Soviet Union and the communist world, where as the leftist who read The Nation, or I might say now the Village Voice or any other leftist organs, would have been fed a pack of lies. And this had struck me. I mean, that one of the things in the process of, my conversion, if you will, was to realize that, 99% of what the New York Times said about the communist world was true. I mean, we denounced the anti-Soviets, liars, who were just spreading slander when they said that Stalin killed 8 million people. Well, I mean, we know today that he killed, the minimum estimate is 30 million. And, Solzhenitsyn, his estimate is 60 million. So the most extreme, as it were, anti-communists, anti-Soviets, whatever you want to call them, understated the evils of the communist empire. I will tell you right now that when the record is shown on China, on the Cultural Revolution, which we in the left supported, when the record is revealed about Castro's Cuba, which we in the left supported and which the left still supports, people will be horrified at the reality. The difference, if you want to just take Afghanistan, Afghanistan is not the Soviet Union's Vietnam. There are no TV cameras in Afghanistan. The world press is not there. The Red Cross is not there. There are no international health agencies. There's no information coming out of there. The information that one has from conservative quarters, which I believe, just on historical evidence of everything in the past, has got to be understated, shows that what is going on there is more terrible than anything that we have seen since the Nazi blitzkriegs of the Second World War. We've just, for example, had the documentation on the famine that Stalin induced in the Ukraine in the 30s, where 8 million people were deliberately destroyed. It's taken 40, 50 years for the facts of that to come out. To me, there is this tremendous imbalance in the reality perception of the left. The left is is not only it's diluted, but it spreads its delusion throughout the society. To me, the left is carrying an ideological virus which is comparable to the AIDS virus. I mean, that's the analogy. It breaks down the social immune system. In a civil war, there's always atrocities. During the Korean War, the left trotted out this, the United States was alleged to be spreading germ warfare and so forth. It is a tactic which, can have no effect on the Soviet side because the Soviets don't have a free press in the first place, and it never gets to their people. But it has a tremendous impact in America precisely because Americans are decent people and have a civilized response to these things. And so the left is poisoning the atmosphere here and weakening America's will to resist by portraying its enemies as humanitarians when they're ruthless thugs, and by magnifying every atrocity that's committed, on the opposition side, that is, on the side of the freedom fighters, as for example in Nicaragua. And the left lobby is very powerful. I mean, as I said, when I was young, the left was isolated, and people didn't listen to it. Today, it is so powerful that it affected the congressional vote on support for the Contras, that there are now hundreds of thousands of Americans who are providing intelligence to the Sandinista communists and the Cuban communists and the Soviet KGB, which runs the intelligence agencies of those countries, material support, and above all, propaganda support in this country. And this fifth column, through alleged human rights organizations, through church organizations, through all kinds of lobbies, was able to tip the congressional vote against the freedom fighters in Central America. And as a result, since the president is aware, he is tasked with the national security, the president or his national security staff tried to continue that operation, and we have had a constitutional crisis in this country as a result. We have now a war, the Congress at loggerheads with the administration. And if the one thing that this does, that one knows that this does, is it weakens this country in its fight against communism.
Well, should the United States government be intervening?
Absolutely. When I was a leftist, I thought, I was a principled against intervention. But, you can see the other side is intervening all over the place. There would not be a Sandinista government in Nicaragua if it weren't for the Russians and the Cubans. The Cubans armed that regime. Fidel Castro put together the Comandante leadership. They provided intelligence. They came in right after the revolution, when it was supposed to be a democratic revolution, arming the army. They pour in $500 million in arms a year. They've got their bases there. The first thing they bring in is their East, German police teams to train them in techniques of, torture and political control. There's a massive intervention by the Soviet Union going on in Nicaragua. The mere fact people can ask that question: was it right for us to intervene in Europe to stop the spread of Nazism? Was it right for us to intervene in the Pacific and stop the Japanese Empire from its expansion? It was right, and it is right. It's not just a question of being right today to intervene in Central America to expel the Soviet presence. It's a matter of survival.
Is that what you mean when you made the reference? It's Paul Revere time?
Yeah, I've been quoted as saying, to me it is Paul Revere time, because the wonderful thing about this country is that people are mainly engaged not in ideological politics, not in seizures of power as they are throughout the Third World and even to an extent in some European countries. But Americans are concerned with their own individual lives. That's what an individualistic society is about. And therefore, they're fairly unaware, until it just hits them in the face, of the rest of the world. Look at the history of our interventions, as it were, in global wars. The way we got into the First World War was they sank one of our ships, right? It was the sinking of the Lusitania. And in the Second World War, I mean, Hitler was marching all over Europe. The Japanese were in China and everywhere else. The United States could not engage in that war until the attack on Pearl Harbor. And as you know, some Americans can recall, there's a great question as to whether Franklin Roosevelt actually knew about the Pearl Harbor attack or lured the Japanese into attacking Pearl Harbor in order to get the country to respond to the war. One of the opening of the archives, the Nazi archives from the 30s, shows that one of the greatest factors in making the Second World War actually come about was the peace movement in the Western countries. That in England, there had been the famous debate at Oxford that it was, resolved not to fight for king and country. And this pacifism, and everybody's familiar with Neville Chamberlain and how, the appeasers who kept giving Hitler what he wanted. But in opening the archives, we see the diaries of the German General Staff saying, right before Munich, that we better get rid of this guy, meaning Hitler, because the Allies are not going to sit back and take this, and we don't want to go to war. But then the Allies would give in, and Hitler's position would be strengthened. And I believe, the Tonkin Gulf is the latest after the Lusitania and Pearl Harbor. Again, there was an aggression. North Vietnam attacked South Vietnam, basically down the Ho Chi Minh Trail. The United States president ought to have been able to go on TV and announce this and declare war and launching massive bombing attacks on Hanoi, which would have avoided the 10 years of the Vietnam War. It would have hit the aggressor hard at the outset and stopped him. We wouldn't have gotten involved in that incredible quagmire that has been so costly to this country. But the president politically didn't feel he could do that. There's too much opposition in this country to such attacks. We've seen it with the Gaddafi terrorizing American citizens across the globe. The president, organized this retaliatory strike. He had to promise everybody that he wasn't trying to kill Gaddafi. Why? I mean, he should have killed Gaddafi. If Gaddafi is, he's a murderer, and he has been spreading terror throughout the Western world. And the consequence, of course, of the United States attack is that Gaddafi, his activity ceased for a long time. But we, as a democracy, are slow to defend ourselves, slow to recognize these threats. And as a result, I think of the Vietnam War, I know of the Vietnam War, slower than ever before. And that's what concerns me as somebody who was on the left during, in the anti-war movement during the Vietnam War and can see what's happened. That Americans, you see it among congressmen today, they don't want another Vietnam, we shouldn't intervene. It's as though the United States United States interventions can only bring misery to other peoples, when in fact, we have saved Europe twice in this century from totalitarianism. Our occupation of Japan created democracy in Japan. Japan wasn't a democracy for thousands of years until the United States occupied Japan and created a democracy in Japan. The United States cannot remake the world. It cannot make democracies everywhere, but if there is any hope for democracy, freedom, or prosperity, in other nations of the world, it is by the United States supporting the forces of democracy in those countries, and and supporting their economic advance, which I believe can only take place, again, on the basis of a free market economy. This is one of the things also as a leftist that I have learned, that socialism means poverty and misery for people. When the Soviet Union was still Russia, it was a breadbasket of Europe. It exported grain. Since the Marxists ruined the agricultural economy in the Soviet Union, as they have everywhere they have taken power, the Soviet Union has been an importer of grain. Cuba is poorer today economically. It's poorer. The only people who aren't poor are wealthy. They've just changed. The wealthy now are the communist leaders of Cuba. But everywhere communism, everywhere Marxism takes hold, it de-develops countries. It makes them It's just a prescription for economic disaster, which is why communist powers are expansionists. They cannot, if the Soviet Union did not have to steal its technology from the West, if the Soviet Union could feed its people, it could give them freedom if it could feed its people, and if it could provide them with the kind of goods they can get in the West. But it's explosive opening to the West, because people will just see that life here is better. That's what communism is afraid of.
Vladimir Bukovsky, whom I know you know, he indicates that the only thing that the Soviets have to trade in the world is fear and blackmail.
And
weapons. That's their only product.
That's exactly right. And they have weapons. They have the techniques of torture. And let's remember, I mean, even the word knout is a Russian word, but they are very sophisticated at political control. That's the kind of things that they export. They don't, I mean, anybody who thinks that socialism is a wonderful economic medicine should just try to remember a Soviet good that they bought that wasn't vodka or caviar recently.
Bukovsky also made this comment recently, and it's reflecting some of what you're saying. Quote, "The chief weapon and greatest asset, Russia's, is the combined illusions, blindness, and indecision of those who do not dare to proclaim themselves its opponents. The first battle to be fought and won is in the realm of public opinion, against disinformation handed out and swallowed, against political ignorance, against indifferences and blind fear." Now, is that the fifth column that you're talking about?
I think he's left out the fifth column. The indecision and the blindness, applies to, I mean, there are a lot of Democrats, for example, and some very liberal Republicans who are just, they just don't see the threat, and they are blind, and they're always giving, I mean, it's an American thing to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. But there is a militant, dedicated fifth column left in this country. People who have been in this struggle for decades. This is something that most Americans do not understand. It is like a religion. It is from one generation to the next. In 1917, if you are a Marxist, if you are part of that tradition, I should say, you believe that a civil war was begun in 1917, which is going on to this day, in which the Soviet Union is the insurer, as it were, of revolution, that it provides the power for the one side of this civil war, this class war, to succeed. For most of my colleagues, their parents were part of this war and served Joseph Stalin. Then their generation was part of this war and defeated the United States in Vietnam and made possible a Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and extrusion of Soviet power into Africa and Central America. And their children are now 20 and out there. And the same people who brought you Vietnam, or the children of those people, and those people combined, are now want to bring you the same kind of bloodbath in Africa and the same kind of communist victory. That, to my mind, is what is going on in South Africa today.
And celebrities, I'll name one, Ed Asner, who goes off to Managua, Nicaragua. Are you saying he's self-deluding himself? Is that how we explain these kinds of people?
Well, there are degrees of. I mean, I self-deluded myself. There are a few cynics. Fidel Castro is a total cynic, but people on the left believe a lot of what they say. Where they are dishonest is in presenting themselves as liberals and progressives or interested in human rights. Ed Asner is on a sponsor of a medical aid committee to El Salvador, as though he's concerned. Now, of course, everybody is concerned when they see a baby napalmed or whatever, bayoneted or whatever goes on in these countries. There's nobody, right or left, or very few people except psychopaths, who are not concerned. But in Asner's case, it's a very selective concern. He does not have a comparable concern, as it were, say for the Afghani children who are being slaughtered at 100 times the rate say, of people in Salvador, where the slaughter is a foreign power that's invaded, and where in Salvador you have a civil war, and what the left totally ignores is that the insurgents, the communist guerrillas who are insurgents, have very little popular support. Certainly not enough to launch a civil war. The reason they have a civil war is twofold. One is that they've been supplied by weapons by the Soviet bloc, by the Vietnamese communists, and by Nicaragua and Cuba. And the other is that they know that if they hold out long enough and cause enough bloodshed, thanks to the lobbying efforts of the Ed Asners and their influence on the U.S. Congress, the United States might pull the rug from under the Duarte regime or under the Salvadorian government regime, and the rebels who are backed by state powers in Cuba, in Nicaragua, and in Moscow, they'll win.
What about South Africa? You mentioned the problems in Africa.
Yeah, South Africa, here's an example. I mean, the legislation, the divestment, the American foreign policy on South Africa, congressionally sanctioned foreign policy on sanctions and divestments, was written by Ron Dellums, who, as I say, wants to see a communist victory in South Africa. The ANC is a communist organization. It's not just that they're communists who are part of the leadership. Its ideology is, I mean, if you read the statements of its leaders, its ideology is communist, it's Marxist. They have supported in the Sino-Soviet dispute, that is, wherever the Chinese and the Soviet Communist parties disagree, they support the Soviets down the line in every position. The ANC has positions like, it regards the Korean War as a case of South Korea and the United States attacking North Korea. Their arms are all Soviet supplied, and so forth. The divestment does one thing. It immediately destabilizes, is an attempt to destabilize the South African regime, to anoint the ANC as the legitimate ruler of South Africa. And the consequence will be a bloody civil war in which millions, probably, maybe only hundreds of thousands of black people will be killed. And where, if the ANC wins, the Soviets will have another satellite empire. We've seen this in Vietnam. We've seen it in Cuba. You see it, all over the place. What I've learned is that when I look at South Africa, when I was a leftist, and people would say to me, well, what happens if the United States pulls out of Vietnam? And I would say, well, it doesn't really matter what happens, because that's their country. It's the Vietnamese country, and things can only be better if the United States withdraws, if the United States loses. Well, I live to see that things can be a hell of a lot worse. And while I hate the apartheid regime and hate racism in any form, whether it's left racism or right-wing racism, whether it's white racism or black racism, I cannot take the same kind of attitude towards the future of South Africa. And I cannot say it doesn't matter what happens. It matters. Things could be a hell of a lot worse. And when you look at the rest of black Africa, where the left has taken power, you see all one-party regimes, you see genocidal massacres. I mean, more people are killed in Uganda in 1 week than were killed in the height of the repression in South Africa in a year. More black people were killed in Uganda in a week. Hundreds of thousands of people have been slaughtered in Uganda. And there are tribal rivalries which have come out because of the way these left regimes have run things in their totalitarian ways. Whereas Asia in the last 20 years has increased economically in its productivity and the income of its people. South Africa not South Africa. Africa, excluding South Africa, is the only place in the world where it's declined for 20 years as a direct consequence of left policies. I think that for a Democrat, and for anybody who's concerned about black people in South Africa, support for people like Buthelezi is the only viable support. Buthelezi is anti-apartheid, but he's anti-communist, and he wants a constructive solution. He doesn't want to see a bloody civil war. The left wants bloodshed in South Africa. It wants civil war, and it wants a communist victory.
I have a question on that. I'd like you to fix your microphone while I'm doing that. I think it's slipping down. We may be losing a little bit of input. I guess that's okay now. David, that suggests a very, very relevant point to your opening comment about the fifth column, etc. In that if I or you say anything about the South African situation that is in any way positive, it is immediately related to the civil rights issue here in the United States, and we become labeled as racist.
Yeah, that's ridiculous. See, we have a case in this country where we have a blatant left-wing McCarthyism on these kind of issues, where the issue itself about what is the practically the best course to take for the well-being of South African people, and of the vast mass of black people in South Africa, you can't even discuss this issue because people will call you a racist, and they call you. It's exactly the tactics that Joe McCarthy used, and it is now a monopoly of the left, in my view, in this country. The left is a McCarthyist, and it's really a fascist force in this country. You can't speak on campus. You go to campuses, people shout you down, or they threaten you with violence. This is what we saw, in the 30s and the 20s in Germany, and it is why, as an ex-radical, I see this danger. So, when I see somebody like Ron Dellums, who hates America. From the time when he was supporting the Black Panthers in the 60s and calling for them to bring the system down, he has shown in legislative piece after legislative piece, in speech after speech, he hates this country. When the Soviets invaded Afghanistan, he said the evil I find is in Washington. Washington is the main threat to the peace. Washington is evil. When he says that about Moscow, he'll never say that about Moscow. Now, this man who has this attitude towards America, unbridled hatred, is the man who has written our policy on South Africa. To me, this is, it's frightening. We are in a frightening situation right now because of it's a political situation, because of the political situation.
You, in an article called Vietnam Lessons, conclude with the following sentence, part of a sentence. Quote, Americans need to respect and encourage their own generosity, their tolerance for internal dissent, and their willingness to come to the aid of people who are fighting for their freedom. Is that a pretty good statement of how you feel about this country?
Yes, I feel that one of the wonderful things, one of the things that I have to be grateful for is it's the amazing tolerance in this country. I was a kind of behind-the-scenes player in the 60s, but if we look at Tom Hayden, who was out front, Tom Hayden, orchestrated the demonstrations in Chicago, which he knew very well were going to lead to a riot, and which destroyed the presidential possibilities of the Democratic Party in the year 1968. Tom Hayden has traveled to Hanoi. He has worked with the America's enemies in times of war. Traveled to Hanoi at that time. Advised the Vietnamese on psychological warfare against the United States. And Tom Hayden now is a state assemblyman in California. And he is, helps to write the Democratic National Platform. And then most other countries, he'd be in jail. In any of the socialist countries, he would have been shot. I myself, would undoubtedly have been shot in any socialist country and would have spent most of my life in jail as a result of what I did. But I have been given a second chance and a second life, as is Tom. And this is the great strength of this country in ways. Its generosity allows it to tap resources. That's why we're a nation of refugees. People come here. Individuals feel that they have a chance, to realize their potentials. But the other side of that generosity is an unwillingness to see who your enemies are and to name them and identify them and to fight them until, as I say, until they sink a ship or destroy a whole base, as at Pearl Harbor. And the world has gotten much smaller in our lifetime. As Colonel Oliver North, when he was testifying before the committees, said, you know, because of the base the Russians have in Cuba, they can fly their reconnaissance flights and escort them with their fighter planes 14 miles off the coast of Virginia. When they consolidate the base in Nicaragua, they'll be able to do that on the West Coast. We don't have the lead time anymore that allows us to be so generous. I feel that I don't want to see us you know, go into a witch hunting frenzy or anything like that. But I feel a stigma has to be placed on the left for its disloyalty, its commitment to totalitarianism, to totalitarian powers, its dishonesty, its subversive activity, which sets out in a cynical way to destroy the institutions of this country and to support its enemies. And I feel that we better do that now before it's too late.